Hey, let's talk about games. Hello guys, you're listening to Hydra. Today we're going to be doing a discussion-based video on the suppression system of Inquisitor Martyr. That's right, we're going to be talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of this in-game feature. Remember guys, the purpose of these videos is to give you guys a platform in which to discuss. Obviously this is just my views, they are subjective. You may agree, you may disagree, but what I'd love to see down below in the comments is your thoughts on this feature, what you think of it, how it's working. If you've got any ideas around it, shout it down in the comments below, because currently for me, I feel like this is one of the game's most detrimental features towards the vision of the game, well, according to what the developers want it to be. Let me explain. So, to start things off, let's first acknowledge what the suppression system is. The suppression is the bar that goes around your health, or on an enemy it goes sort of horizontally alongside their health, looking a little bit like a shield, and the purpose of such a thing is to really provide a visual representation of crowd control, immunity, or resistance, as it were. So the lower you get in terms of your suppression or an enemy's, the more you are opened up to slows, shocks, stuns, freezes, and once you get down to the red, you open yourself up for knockdowns, etc., and hard stuns. So the feature itself, let's talk about what it's here to do, and I think it's fairly safe to say the feature itself is really here to prevent you playing like a lemon. And I don't mean that as an insult to other ARPGs, but what this does is it prevents you from charging towards the nearest pack of danger every single time and basically playing recklessly, which is what other games will typically reward you with, like having extra healing based off of the amount of kills you've got within Diablo, Path of Exile, etc. Both of their potion mechanics work off of killing stuff. In this game, you get punished. You open yourself up not only to take more damage, but also to have your suppression bar lowered to the point where you're going to then be stunned, CC'd, etc. And this really is, I feel, somewhat congruent with the developer vision of the game, where they want it to be somewhat slower, somewhat more strategic and tactical. Now, that being said, I'm not trying to suggest that this feature on its own is sufficient to call the game tactical, but love it or hate it, it definitely seems to be somewhat congruent with their aims, in that it slows players down and makes you think about what you're doing within the game. Obviously, this is going to be met with some resistance from players that want to have a gaming experience where they get to play like a wrecking ball. Now, I would state you can still spec into that. You've just got to put up with some slow gameplay first to get to the stage in the game where you can build enough suppression resistance to then play like a lemon if that's your thing, which is totally fine. Now, in terms of what it does well, I think that's about it. It has an impact on the game, we cannot deny that, and it leaves its mark and it makes the game somewhat different to some of the others. Now, let's talk about what it's not doing well, and for me there are a few things that this does, or there are a few implications of this system that are really incongruent with the game's of ambitions or aims according to the developers. Now, the first of which, let's talk about two combat situations which commonly occur. Combat situation number one. You run up to an enemy and you start whacking it. You've got some CC and utility on your abilities and you're whacking and whacking, and the enemy dies before the suppression meter sort of empties as such. And this is very disheartening as a player to see, because not only is your utility completely redundant and useless, and we're talking about elites here because regular enemies don't have it, but genuinely killing trash isn't really that complex, so that's okay. We're talking about killing elites. The problem is, though, that you never got to use any reactionary based ability, because all they are essentially is damage based buttons instead. They don't have any additional effects because that suppression bar just murdered the ability to do anything else. That's situation number one, which will happen more often than not, and especially when you crank the difficulty up a little bit. Situation number two, which I would say is just as bad, if not more depressing. And this is when you whack an enemy and the suppression bar goes down pretty fast. And what happens then is you realise the actual low cooldowns of the abilities that have these CCs and slows and stuns and shocks, etc. is quite low. And this then means you can stun lock what is essentially a dead body in front of you. Because once you've emptied that suppression bar, okay, assuming you don't have to dodge and duck and dip and dive and dodge too much, the enemy's more or less dead. They might as well be a corpse that then you're whacking to make it explode, because they're really not doing anything. If it's a long drawn out fight, I could perhaps see a little bit of argument saying, well, it's still somewhat engaging because you're stun locking them, but the reality is it's quite depressing for a player. I'm not going to show you any footage of the final boss in the game, but to give you a little bit of an understanding as to why I'm coming at it from this angle, I hit the thing for 3 seconds. Now granted, the suppression was bugged at the time because my Vembots, my robot women, the holograms, whatever, were whacking on and reducing the suppression of the boss. I'm not going to say what it is, I'm really tempted here, but it's awesome. And its suppression was empty in 3 seconds, at which point I stun locked it until it was dead. And that is the end of the game boss. And the fight was nothing but disappointing. In terms of combat mechanics, in terms of visuals, I liked it. In terms of story, I loved it. In terms of gameplay, really don't have anything good to say about that fight. Partially because of the broken build I'm playing, but even so, if I had a high suppression weapon, the outcome would have been the same. And either way, it would not have been a tactical or sort of immersive experience where you get to feel like you're being strategic. So here's the issue for me, that either one of these situations which results from the suppression system, the reality is neither of them are strategic and neither of them are tactical. It just is completely incongruent with the developer's vision. So it's working for the players as far as I can see. It's making the players have to think about what they do. But AI aren't thinking about what they do. The AI will play recklessly, and the AI is unfairly punished due to this. I mean, AI needs a little bit of love. So for me, there's a few potential solutions for this, and I'm going to talk you through a few ideas, but again, I'd love to see your thoughts down below, even if you just think this is a problem or not. Now, option number one, obviously our abilities with CC have quite low cooldowns, and you could increase them. You could say, well, what we could maybe do is 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds for the CC-based abilities. The problem is you've only got 4 abilities per weapon, and if you start giving everything lots of cooldowns, then you're more or less dictating what the rotation is going to be and telling people how to use the weapon in a little bit more of a prescriptive manner, which is not a bad thing and not a good thing at the same time. It would give weapons a little bit more unique identity in terms of rotations, perhaps, but it would also be a little bit more detrimental in terms of the ability for players to use weapons their own way. It also wouldn't tackle the issue that sometimes you just don't empty enough suppression of an enemy, so that would probably need a blanket nerf as well. So that's option number one, really just make it so you can only stun stuff less often. Doesn't really get rid of the problem of enemies not being stunned or having their suppression lowered, but again, I'm assuming that would be balanced too within this hypothetical scenario. Now, the next scenario, I think, is a potential, and that is where, and the developers have mentioned this, is they're looking into diminishing returns. And diminishing returns basically means, well, it kind of means it's what the suppression system is. It's a resistance to CC based on the amount of CC you've had, though. So the more you stun something, the more resistant it will become, to the point where you can no longer stun it at all, and it's going to chase you around biting your bum, and you can no longer interrupt it. Now, one of the problems to me is they've already got a visual representation of the resistance to CC, which is the suppression bar in an enemy. So one thing I'm thinking with this, if it were to be entertained, is that it's going to be somewhat confusing, because you're going to think, oh, hang on, I've lowered your suppression and now I've stunned you, and now I can't stun you because of some... It's going to be quite hard visually, I think, on players, and a little bit confusing, although mechanically it would work and it would potentially be a step up or improvement in terms of what we got already. And of course, this is going with the assumption that, again, suppression is balanced. Now, my thoughts on this is what are my preferences, really, and this is not necessarily to say that this is the best solution, this is just the best I personally can come up with, is to actually give enemies suppression regen based on the amount of utility or CC that you've inflicted, which for me is a visual representation of crowd control, which fits into the mechanism already at play. So basically how this would manifest is if you attacked an enemy and you got their suppression down, what would happen is then, if you slowed them, it would start regenning slowly, and it might eventually, if you slowed them a couple of times, start regenning faster than you're doing damage, meaning you'd have to stop trying to slow them in order to let it go back down to the point where you could stun them again. Or maybe if you stun them, then it would go up a little bit quicker. Now, this obviously has some issues. Firstly, I would say you probably would need to reduce enemy suppression bars by 80% flat off, so you can actually whack an enemy a couple of times, inflict a CC if you need to, and then there may be a cooldown period where obviously the regen will be there and you will no longer be able to. For me, this seems like the best option, where it's not destroying an in-game mechanic, it's just adding a little bit of a layer. It's really just as far as adding a buff to enemies, and that's all it is. Reducing their base suppression and giving them a buff that simply, after being CC'd, increases suppression regeneration. For me, it makes a bit of sense. I think it could work. I'm not entirely sure. There would be some issues with abilities that have their spamming buttons having CC or utility, but even then it would still, in my opinion, be a dramatic impact or dramatic improvement over the current system, where in neither situation are we being tactical or strategic with the use of our abilities. You just have to look at the situational buttons you have the potential to use: knockdowns, stuns, interrupts, and yet within the game we rarely ever get to interrupt, simply because the suppression system makes the game far less tactical. Guys, I'd love to know what you think of this down in the comments below. What do you think of the system? Do you enjoy it on the player? But let's perhaps focus on how you find it on enemies. Does it make sense? Is it useful? Does it add something to the combat that you're not entirely used to? Do you think that it is just detrimental to the game, or rather detrimental to the vision of the game, which is a tactical and strategic ARPG? Guys, really curious what you think. Let me know down in the comments below. Hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you again soon for some more tips and guides. Take care.